At exactly 14:43:08 Tuesday morning solar time, an enormous explosion occurred in Pluto vicinity. It was quickly pinpointed to Charon, Pluto's moon. Transtemporal, the Titan-based corporation, is known to have a large research center on Charon, but there has been no communication with the facility since the explosion.
This is men to leave to U-35661 approaching.
You've got the Loadstar and Iron Dog Bodine. I've been rolling in the outer for 2 weeks, so I would appreciate...
Loadstar, your ejector's too flat. You'll have to burn off 2 VUs or risk relaunch.
Sorry, but I don't have enough deuterium to muss up a dandelion. Is that you, Ward?
Stand by, Loadstar. U-35661, I've been authorized to land you. Maintain attitude. You're now at 00 and passing the outer mark. You'll be fine, Tully. About 65 gigs.
Yes, I know, Ward.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Loadstar, the Legend of Tully Bodine, an on-rails full-motion video shooter developed and published by Rocket Science Games in 1994 for the Sega CD, with the Microsoft DOS release following in 1995. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 98. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We have weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. Everything is out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. Might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine. Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine, is an on-rails full-motion video shooter developed and published by Rocket Science Games in 1994 for the Sega CD, with an MS-DOS release following in 1995. Before we can talk about Loadstar, we need to take a step back and talk about the company behind the game, Rocket Science Games. And to do that, we need to talk about the company's primary founder, Steve Blank. If you're like me, Steve Blank's name might not exactly spark a ton of memory or recognition, but in reality, Blank has had a highly influential entrepreneurial career spanning a ton of different focus areas and industries. And in fact, Blank's career from the late 70s through the mid-90s can best be described as a period of serial entrepreneurship, where Blank founded and participated in a number of unique startup companies in the hopes of building them into successful business ventures and eventually making a ton of money in the process. Blank didn't begin his working life as an entrepreneur, though. Instead, Blank's early adult years were spent deployed in Thailand as part of the United States Air Force during the Vietnam War, a period of time that saw him maintaining various electronic equipment for the U.S. military presence that was stationed in the country. After 4 years in the Air Force, Blank decided to return home to the United States, and in 1978, he ended up settling down in one of the biggest hotbeds of technological activity in the world, Silicon Valley. After arriving in Silicon Valley, Blank joined a company named the Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory, or ESL, which was responsible for helping the United States government perform reconnaissance on various perceived and potential threats, most prominently assisting the U.S. government with understanding Soviet technology and weaponry that was being created during the Cold War, a period of time that saw the United States and Soviet Union continually attempt to one-up each other in terms of technology, military superiority, and scientific expertise, just to name a few of the tensions prevalent during that time. While it's not clear exactly how much of Blank's personal contributions impacted the company's work with the government, the technologies Blank was exposed to while working with ESL kindled a personal interest in continuing to explore future technological innovations, which is what led Blank to eventually leave ESL in the hopes of joining other companies that were attempting to make meaningful technological contributions to the world. Over the next 10-ish years, a little over 10 years, Blank would change jobs no less than 8 times, joining a number of different companies, some of which had been well-established, long-standing organizations, while others were more startup in nature, demonstrating the constantly shifting composition of Silicon Valley in general. Over this period of time, Blank would also become more interested in the concept of starting his own technology-centric company, which is what prompted him to pursue a new joint venture with fellow entrepreneur Peter Barrett, and in 1993, the two men founded a brand new company, Rocket Science Games. Rocket Science Games may not be the most well-remembered video game company today, but back when it was founded, it was actually a surprisingly big deal. Blank and Barrett had intended the company to represent a fusion of the best technology, coupled with the brightest and most talented video game designers and Hollywood veterans from across both the film and video game industries. Their goal, from the very first moment Rocket Science Games existed as a company, was to marry Hollywood and gaming into a dynamic duo of awesomeness, which meant they were going to be focusing on a very specific style of video game. That style of video game, you may have guessed, was none other than the interactive movie, where traditional gameplay would be married with live-action full-motion video, or FMV, sequences to create games that would, hopefully, represent the best parts of both Hollywood films and video game experiences. Longtime listeners know that I am a huge fan of FMV games of all varieties, whether choose-your-own adventure-styled quick-time event titles, rail shooters with overlaid graphics and FMV backgrounds, traditional games peppered with live-action cutscenes, and pretty much everything in between. I don't care whether these games have the best actors or are staffed by game developers moonlighting as amateur thespians. I don't care whether these games have outstanding dialogue or the script contains more cheese than a pizza factory. I don't care whether the sets look like real-world locations or whether the scenery looks like what you might see set on the stage of a middle school play. The bottom line is, I love FMV titles of all varieties, and Rocket Science Games, upon their founding, was about to embark on creating their own FMV experiences to hopefully set the entire gaming world on fire. More modern gamers might be wondering why a company would intentionally pigeonhole themselves to focus their work primarily on FMV titles, and to that I would say, because FMV in the 90s was a big deal and a potentially lucrative market. With the proliferation of CD-ROM technology and the storage potential CDs provided, game developers had many fewer restrictions when creating their games, and many looked at the expanded storage space provided by CDs as a way to integrate real-world graphics, so to speak, into their titles. In many cases, this meant including full-motion video sequences in their games, and because nearly all games up to this point had been focused on pushing pixelated characters rather than real people, this was viewed across the industry as a significant advancement in the overall evolution of video games. Numerous companies would end up trying their hand at creating full-motion video titles, but one company in particular would become fairly notorious for really attempting to push the technology, primarily because they had just released a CD-ROM-based add-on for their latest 16-bit home console, and they were really looking at a way to sell that add-on to prospective buyers. That company, of course, was none other than Sega, who had just released their Sega CD peripheral in 1992 and had, over the course of the year following the Sega CD's release, begun to partner with a number of companies to deliver multimedia, full-motion video-based experiences to players, which is what led to Sega partnering with Tom Zito's company Digital Pictures to release a number of full-motion video titles for their system, including Night Trap and Sewer Shark. And this drive to continue developing full-motion video titles for their console is what further led to Sega agreeing to a partnership with Rocket Science Games, and it's not really hard to see why Sega would want to work with the company. Rocket Science Games was touting itself as one of the most technologically advanced video game development companies in the world, capable of combining the might of Silicon Valley with the storytelling of Hollywood and the design prowess of the video game industry's top talents. Sega thought a partnership with the company would enable them to further build out their Sega CD FMV ecosystem, and Rocket Science Games, similarly, believed that a partnership with Sega would enable their eventual games to find an already established user base who would, hopefully, continue to have an interest in FMV-based titles. So, the two companies, along with German music publishing company Bertelsmann Music Group, or BMG, entered into a publishing arrangement where Rocket Science Games, or RSG, would create FMV titles with the Sega CD as the target platform, with Sega publishing RSG's titles in North America, and BMG publishing RSG's games in Europe. This publishing deal gave Sega a degree of exclusivity, which was good news for them, and also infused RSG with a significant amount of capital to the tune of $12 million, which was obviously a major feather in their proverbial caps. With a first round of funding secured and publishing partners identified, RSG set out to begin building up their staff so that they could eventually begin creating the future of video game entertainment. Like I previously mentioned, Steve Blank wanted Rocket Science Games to utilize the best talent for all of their titles, and to that end, RSG went on a hiring spree to attempt to secure the best and brightest individuals from across numerous industries. From film, they hired Ron Cobb, an individual with a fascinating history in Hollywood whose career spanned literal decades. His first work was as a Disney artist working on the classic film Sleeping Beauty, after which he became a newspaper editorial cartoonist before eventually landing back in Hollywood, where he would go on to contribute concept art and design assistance for a dizzying array of blockbuster film releases, including Star Wars, where he designed many of the inhabitants that make up the film's cantina scene, Conan the Barbarian, where he designed the visually distinctive swords used by Arnold Schwarzenegger throughout the movie, and additional concept designs for films like Alien, Total Recall, and True Lies, just to name a few. He also contributed an early script for the film that would eventually become E.T., co-wrote an episode of the popular mind-bending television show The Twilight Zone along with his wife, and would be credited as a DeLorean time travel consultant for 1985's massively popular Back to the Future film release. While I'm not sure exactly what a DeLorean time travel consultant does, the fact that Cobb can technically make that his business card title is kinda awesome. Blank and the rest of the RSG team also went out of their way to create partnerships with some of the best special effects crews working in film, most prominently George Lucas's Industrial Lights and Magic, who were widely considered to be the best company working in special effects at the time. If you've seen a movie released in the 80s or later that utilized any degree of special effects, you probably saw Industrial Lights and Magic at work, though their most famous efforts were associated with big-budget blockbuster films like Star Wars, Terminator 2, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Jurassic Park. The thought at Rocket Science Games was, if they were going to wow gamers with their forthcoming full-motion video titles, they needed the best video production and special effects available, and Industrial Lights and Magic certainly fit that requirement in the early to mid-90s. So, Hollywood talent? Check. Rocket Science Games had that covered. Turning their attention to the video game industry, RSG would poach Brian Moriarty from LucasArts, the well-known adventure game designer who had worked on classic text-based titles like Infocom's Zork series, created one of Lucasfilm's most innovative and distinct adventure titles, Loom, and spearheaded one of the failed iterations of the early design concepts for the game that would eventually become the Dig. After Moriarty's version of the Dig ended up being cancelled, he was looking for a new workplace to call home, and Rocket Science Games' promise of an unparalleled team of talent intrigued Moriarty, so much so that he joined the company without a second thought in 1994. With the video game talent portion of RSG's equation out of the way, they then turned to the world of software development, because they realized that all of the creative talent in the world wouldn't mean anything if they didn't have a team of dedicated technical people to bring their gaming visions to life. And while RSG would end up building a fairly strong team of technical talent, one name definitely stands out from the pack, someone who even today is likely familiar to many of you. It turns out that one of RSG's earliest technical hires was none other than Elon Musk, the entrepreneur who would be responsible for one of the most popular online payment systems in the world, PayPal, the engineer who would create SpaceX and disrupt the entire industrial manufacturing industry, the person with enough money to single-handedly eliminate the Twitterverse and replace it with X, a name that I still have a hard time saying with a straight face. That guy was part of Rocket Science Games' software development team. Anyway, with a staff full of talented individuals coming together under one roof, RSG needed to figure out what game they would assign the team to work on. And here, discussions with their most successful video game publisher, Sega, would help direct the company's efforts. Recall that Sega, with their Sega CD peripheral, had released a number of full-motion video titles over the years, with one of their first efforts being the on-rails shooter Sewer Shark, the original pack-in title for the peripheral that introduced countless gamers to the wonders of FMV and gaming. Sega considered that it might be an interesting idea to take the general framework from Sewer Shark, that being an on-rails FMV-based shooter, and modernized it, so to speak, with current technology. Even though Sewer Shark had just formally released 2 years prior, the game itself was the result of the failed Hasbro Control Vision console from the mid-80s, so in essence, the game was over 7 years old, which was a lifetime in the rapidly blossoming video game industry of the time. So, Sega and Rocket Science Games began talking about the potential of creating a Sewer Shark-like experience, and everyone on both sides agreed that this was an awesome idea. And with that, work on the game that would eventually be known as Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine, officially began. Now, you might imagine that with such a talented team of designers, developers, creative storytellers, and artistic visionaries, there would be little possibility for failure. And even outside of work on the game, the company, Rocket Science Games, was experiencing unheard of growth, especially for a company that had yet to release any sort of product to general consumers. There was a ton of hype surrounding the company, though, which led to an even greater influx of funding, which, including Sega's and BMG's initial investment, brought the company's capital up to $35 million in the 18 months following its founding. With such interest, even industry press began to take notice, and Rocket Science Games would end up making the cover of Wired magazine, along with a number of publications declaring Rocket Science Games to be one of the hottest companies in the Silicon Valley, and certainly a group to watch. The prevailing belief was that RSG was about to set the world on fire, and once again, despite not launching a single game up to this point, many reporters and journalists were hailing RSG as the future of the video game industry. Well, it turns out, despite the company's hype machine running in overdrive, the reality of the situation was that leadership inside the company was focused more on growing their capital as opposed to creating and releasing quality gaming experiences. Sure, they had a talented team of creative personnel ready to make games, but that creative and technical team would frequently encounter hurdles and roadblocks from leadership at the company. In fact, Brian Moriarty would later claim in an interview that there was next to no quality control in place at the company, and that leadership was really more focused on creating an impressive technical showcase to show off their Hollywood talent and aspirations, as opposed to making a meaningful interactive experience for gamers to enjoy. And interestingly, this focus on glamour over substance was being perpetuated by the press of the time, who would see early looks at Loadstar and other in-development RSG games and tell Steve Blank that his games were going to literally be unlike anything the video game industry had ever seen. Blank honestly believed that his company was on the verge of something truly unique and special, and as a result, he and the rest of the leadership team started to push for games to release sooner rather than later, the thought being that they could make even more money if they could, sell some games. This drive to ship their games as quickly as possible was perhaps most noticeable when looking at the company's quality control guidelines, which were effectively non-existent. Moriarty explained that company leadership was ready to declare a game as ready to ship if it met the most bare definition of playable possible, which in this case meant the game could run for several hours without crashing. That was literally the definition of done at Rocket Science Games, and was also, ironically, the only requirement Sega had in place before a company could release a title on one of their console platforms. And even beyond that, it was that definition of done that would lead to Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine, releasing to Sega CD players in 1994, with an MS-DOS port following in 1995. Upon its release, and despite the lack of quality control in place at RSG, Loadstar would end up being fairly well liked by many critics, with some claiming the game's production values were simply insane in comparison to other titles, with many declaring the FMV sequences to be some of the finest ever seen on a home console, even though the Sega CD's own hardware limitations meant that the resolution and technical aspects of the video sequences were restricted. Some reviewers opined that a version of Loadstar on a more capable system like the Panasonic 3DO or even Sega's 32X would be a revolutionary experience and would truly serve to marry Hollywood and video games in a match made in heaven. And for its part, Rocket Science Games spared little expense in getting Hollywood-level acting talent on board for the game too, as they brought in Academy Award-nominated actor Ned Beatty to star as the game's primary antagonist, along with other Hollywood actors playing various roles in the game. Now, I don't know that I would call anyone here an A-list talent, so to speak, but the casting was certainly a step up from most FMV-based titles who oftentimes cast either unknowns or game developers themselves in starring roles. Still, despite some early critical praise, Loadstar did have some critics who felt the game was too much style and not enough gameplay, with one magazine reviewer for Next Generation magazine stating, and I quote, "All the company managed to do is to prove just how little $3 million worth of Ned Beatty on digital footage adds to a game." That comment was admittedly a bit harsh, and the fact is that it doesn't really matter what the critics said, whether positive or negative, as long as players purchased and enjoyed the title. There was just one issue. It turns out, players would not purchase the title, and all of the bells and whistles that Rocket Science Games thought would endear their game to millions of players would end up being unseen by the majority of the game-playing population. In fact, Loadstar, along with Rocket Science Games' second title, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs: The Second Cataclysm, would end up selling under 8,000 copies combined in the years following their release, which by anyone's estimation represents a catastrophic sales failure. This lack of sales surprised nearly everyone in leadership at the time, because they believed they were really going to be the next big thing in gaming. In an interview conducted in 2013, company co-founder Steve Blank commented on this exact situation. He stated, and I quote, "The press called Rocket Science one of the hottest companies in Silicon Valley and predicted that our games would be great because the storyboards and trailers were spectacular. 90 days later, I found out our games are terrible. No one is buying them. Our best engineers started leaving, and with 120 people and a huge burn rate, we're running out of money and about to crash." And unfortunately for Rocket Science Games, crashing is exactly what would end up happening, as despite efforts to continue developing and releasing games, they would simply end up spending more money than they could recover by their game's sales, and Sega would eventually sever ties with the company because of that overall lack of sales, with other publishers not wanting to work with the company for fear of losing money. This lack of sales, coupled with next to zero publisher interest, is what would finally lead to Rocket Science Games shutting down in 1997, just 4 years after the company began its existence. Over the course of its lifetime, RSG would see the release of 6 games, some of which would be critically acclaimed, like the Myst-inspired adventure title Obsidian, while others, like Wingnuts: Battle in the Sky, would be considered mediocre by most of the critical community. One thing was common across all of RSG's releases, though. They simply never sold well, and the unfortunate fact is that without sales, no company is immune to an eventual shutdown. Loadstar itself would end up being a standalone release, despite initial plans for a full trilogy of titles set in the Loadstar universe. In fact, the reason Loadstar was subtitled The Legend of Tully Bodine is that there were grand plans to create a truly legendary space operatic adventure similar to George Lucas's Star Wars. Those plans would ultimately not come to pass, and Tully Bodine's legend would end up being relegated to a single adventure involving the transport of contraband camels while being pursued by an unscrupulous sheriff across a series of space train tracks. Not exactly the let's save the world narrative of most legendary titles, but hey, even Luke Skywalker began his life on a small farm. Loadstar: The Legend of Tully Bodine, along with its developer Rocket Science Games, provide a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks that a lack of substance can be overcome by throwing money at something, or adding in a ton of style and visual dazzle. While that's certainly an approach to game development, it's one that oftentimes is not met with nearly as much success as you might otherwise assume, and Rocket Science Games' legacy certainly proves that point. While neither Loadstar nor Rocket Science Games are really talked about at any length today, that does not mean they shouldn't be recognized from a historical perspective, as I believe even the most commercially unsuccessful or critically panned games and companies still have a story to tell. I'll let you know my own personal opinions on Loadstar, RSG's first game, in just a little bit. While neither the game nor the company may have ultimately been successful, they still contributed a short thread to the overall fabric of the video and computer game industry. And regardless of the level of that contribution, I still believe Loadstar and Rocket Science Games deserve to be remembered. now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Loadstar: The Legend of Tully Bodine today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. Before we begin though, I should note that I ended up playing the MS-DOS version of the title, for the sole reason that that version actually had more content than the Sega CD version, which for some reason was missing some boss fights and was, from what I can tell, a decidedly easier experience than the PC version. I love Sega CD FMV titles, and I know at some point I'll go back and play this one on that system, simply because I feel the need to experience it, but I really wanted to get the full experience, which for Loadstar: The Legend of Tully Bodine meant playing on PC. Anyway, like we talked about, Loadstar is a full-motion video title with live-action cutscenes interspersed between several fairly lengthy gameplay segments, all of which are made up of streaming video with a modicum of player choice and interaction thrown in for good measure. As an on-rails shooter, you don't have a ton of freedom to move your ship, the titular Loadstar, around the screen, though you do have some opportunity to alter your forward trajectory down a number of different tracks, which we'll talk about in a little bit. As you make your way through the game's various levels, you'll face several different enemies, all of whom want nothing more than to derail your plans and your ship before you reach your goal. Luckily, your blaster provides you with ample firepower to deal with those enemies, though the question is, do you have a fast enough trigger finger to shoot them before they shoot you? Listening to that brief overview, you might piece together that Loadstar owes more than a little of its inspiration to the Sega CD full-motion video title Sewer Shark, where you control a combat-equipped ship whose job is to fly down a number of sewer tunnels, choose the right tunnels to navigate down at the right time, and shoot increasingly difficult enemies, all the way to your eventual goal of reaching a beachside paradise called Solar City. If you've played Sewer Shark before, or if you've listened to our episode on Sewer Shark from last year, you'll have a good idea of what you're going to get when you play Loadstar. But, as we'll soon see, Loadstar adds some interesting and occasionally frustrating wrinkles to the on-rails Sewer Shark-like gameplay formula, and in the process, creates something a bit more unique than its inspiration. So, let's talk about Loadstar's general layout, gameplay mechanics, and overall structure. The entirety of the game is made up of 5 parts: an introductory segment, which is a live-action full-motion video cutscene that sets up the overall narrative for the game, followed by 3 gameplay levels, which is where you'll spend the majority of your time, and finally an ending with a big bad boss battle that leads directly into the game's finale. Each of these segments are meant to be played in sequence, though the game does keep track of how far you've made it into the game, allowing you to restart your progress after the latest completed level should you end up dying and hitting a game over screen. The ability to have your progress saved is a nice touch, because as we'll talk about, getting through some of the segments of the game can be pretty challenging when you're first making your way through the title, and having to restart from the first level every time you fail would have likely gotten tedious after a while. Anyway, when you start the game, you're given only one option before you begin your adventure, and that is which difficulty setting you want to play on. In Loadstar, you're limited to 2 options, easy and hard, and I have to comment on this one because I absolutely despise those difficulty rankings. Now, I know getting upset at how difficulty options are named sounds like a really picky thing to be irritated by, so let me explain. As you all know, when I play a game, I try to play it on whatever default mode the developers originally designed the title using, which for games that have difficulty settings typically equates to a label of normal, medium, default, or something similar. Some games, like Doom and other first-person shooters, have more interesting difficulty categories that use descriptive text to get across what each difficulty setting is meant to represent, but generally speaking, you can tell pretty easily which difficulty setting in a game is meant to be the quote-unquote default developer-intended difficulty that the game was balanced around. In Loadstar, the game's designers decided to forego the traditional difficulty labeling scheme and leave players with only 2 choices, those being easy and hard, and by default, the game has easy selected for you when you start the game. This, for me, created a psychological quandary. On one hand, I recognize that I usually simply use whatever the default difficulty setting is whenever I play a game, so most of you are probably saying, cool, just use that easy difficulty setting and be done with it. The thing is though, I have a major issue with playing a game on easy by choice, even if it is the default, because I feel like that's going to shortchange the challenge to too great of a degree. Considering that particular personal neurosis, That means my only choice for this one was to play the game on hard. And let me tell you, the skill gap between easy and hard on this game is significant. But it's the only way I could guarantee I was going to get a worthwhile, challenging experience, even if that challenge was decidedly more difficult than what I personally thought the game warranted. From my perspective, there either needed to be a normal difficulty between easy and hard, or easy should have been renamed as normal. Either option would have been fine with me. Now, before anyone says anything, yes, I recognize this is a neurotic thing to get worked up about, and I truly don't judge anyone who enjoys playing games on easy or whatever lesser challenging difficulty settings games utilize. This is definitely a me problem, and I fully accept that. Putting aside my own psychological issues, once you decide which difficulty you want to play the game on, the game starts in earnest, with a fully acted recorded scene setting the stage for your adventure to come, followed by the start of level 1, which is where you'll first see the different gameplay mechanics available to you. Like in Sewer Shark, you're in control, sort of a ship that is constantly propelled onwards, without the ability to modify your speed, altitude, or general ship orientation. The goal of the game is to progress through a series of interconnected tracks by choosing the paths that both avoid death while still proceeding in the general direction of your goal, which in each stage is represented by some location, like a loading dock, a fuel station, or a space launch track. Getting from the start of each stage to those final destinations requires responding to your compass, which is displayed at the top of your screen and will always point in the general direction of your goal. Monitoring your compass and choosing the right directions to shift from one track to another, which you can do by pressing either the right or left arrows on your keyboard as you approach a track junction, is one of the most critical mechanics in the game, primarily because you will never ever reach your destination unless you follow your compass directions. And if you miss just a single turn, you run the risk of being punished in several different ways, ranging from lost time, which is significant but at least potentially recoverable, to instant death, which obviously is way worse. If all you needed to do was monitor your compass, that would make the game a ridiculously simple affair. But as you might expect, there's more to the game than simple track navigation. To start, each level has a time limit of 9 minutes, which represents the total time available for you to get from the start of the level to the end destination, inclusive of any deaths or wrong turns you may experience along the way. In other words, you get 9 minutes total to get to your destination, regardless of what happens during your specific run through the level. If you die and have to restart, you're not restarting with 9 minutes, you're restarting with some lower amount of time, depending on how far you had gotten into a level. This, as you might expect, can be extremely punishing, because there is no fast track, so to speak, to get through a stage. There are a prerequisite number of tracks and junctions and enemy waves to progress through, and while there is some randomization as to which tracks appear when, the prescribed path through a level will always take at least 6 to 7 minutes, assuming you're playing perfectly. That leaves approximately 2 minutes for errors, which honestly is not nearly enough time to respond to an issue. While I have overcome a single death on a level before, that was a down-to-the-wire run, and if I hadn't gotten lucky with the boss fight of that stage, I certainly would have failed. What this means is that progressing through each stage requires close to navigational perfection, which would be doable if you weren't constantly besieged by enemies that want nothing more than to ruin your day. As you might have guessed, though, you are in fact constantly besieged by enemies that want nothing more than to ruin your day. And here is where the game's aforementioned difficulty settings come into play, as the rest of the game, based on what I can see, is pretty much identical between easy and hard mode, other than the offensive power of the enemies you'll be facing. Anyway, let's go through 2 illustrative examples. We'll start with an easy mode playthrough on, let's say, level 1. When you begin working your way through the level, you're introduced to the simplest enemy in the game, a blue vehicle of sorts that can occasionally fire a single orb of energy at you. Not a super damaging move, and you have an unlimited supply of your own ammunition, which means you can fire constantly at your foes as your ship automatically propels itself forward, using your mouse to move your targeting reticle around the screen and rapidly clicking your left mouse button to fire. Interestingly, all of the projectiles that enemies fire at you in the game are also able to be deflected by a well-timed blaster shot, meaning you can shoot not only enemies, but also their own attacks that are targeting you, making it so that you can potentially avoid damage simply by skillful usage of your offensive weaponry. On easy mode, this is doable because in the situation I just described, you're dealing with a single blue ball of energy and a single enemy vehicle. And with the rapidity that you can fire your weapon, there's a fair chance that you'll hit both before they can make contact with your ship. Now, let's take a look at the same situation, but with the difficulty flipped to hard mode. You'll see that same blue enemy vehicle, which is fine, and he'll move in the same exact patterns, which is perfect. But now, when he fires at you, instead of one energy orb, he'll fire 4 rapidly expanding homing orbs that will absolutely wreck you. There is no possible way to offensively counterattack that maneuver, and when you first start playing the game and are still getting used to the overall gameplay and mechanics, you'll likely be destroyed within a couple minutes on your first hard mode run. And if you're like me, that experience might make you assume that the game is impossible at that point. But wait, there is a way to respond to that barrage of attacks, and that is by using your shields. By pressing the up arrow on your keyboard, you'll turn your shields on, which will deflect literally any attack that could possibly come into contact with your ship, which is awesome. What isn't awesome is that your shields constantly deplete as long as they're activated, and while you can recharge your shields by simply not using them for a period of time, you'll quickly notice that your shield depletion will greatly exceed the rate at which you can replenish your shields. And with the constant barrage of enemy fire, especially on hard mode, you'll begin to wonder how you can possibly make your way through some of these levels. And then you'll have a light bulb moment as you realize that what the game really wants you to do is time the activation and deactivation of your shield in response to the real-time movement of the projectiles and enemy weaponry making its way to your ship. Meaning, it's not good enough to simply activate your shields, you have to constantly activate and deactivate them numerous times through any given battle until you've managed to dispatch your enemies. That's all well and good, and once you get used to the rhythm of battle, you'll find that you become pretty darn good at timing your shield use so as to maximize the amount of shield you maintain from one fight to the next, while minimizing the total damage you've taken. But then, you realize that while you're rapidly toggling your shield on and off and watching the various enemies you're facing zoom around the screen with multiple projectiles coming at you, you also have to navigate the tracks you're riding on, and press left and right at the appropriate time so as to stay on the appropriate path to your end target. This took me a ton of time to get used to, and multiple playthroughs of each level, before I finally became comfortable enough to sort of focus, but not focus, on the entire screen, allowing me to watch my compass arrow while still moving my targeting cursor to dispatch enemies, all the while rapidly flipping my shield on and off to avoid damage. Luckily, the game does allow you to hold the directional button of the next track shift you want to take, so it's not like you have to have super accurate timing to respond to your shifts in compass direction. But regardless, this for me was a bit of a mixed bag, because on one hand, this level of engagement was dramatically more intense than what most on-rails FMV titles are capable of. On the other hand, I kind of wanted to have a simple lower stress on-rails FMV experience, and Loadstar is absolutely not that. Interestingly, once I did beat the game on hard mode after several hours of trying, I went back and played through the game on easy mode. With my now advanced skill set, I made short work of that playthrough, and ultimately, that was the no-stress experience I had expected when I first sat down to begin playing the game. If only the designers had labeled the easy difficulty as normal. Anyway, as you play the game, especially in the early goings, you will almost undoubtedly die a bunch, and the good news here is that you are given several lives at the start of your adventure, allowing you to respawn in a given level. Each level does have 2 checkpoints, which means that if you get far enough in a given stage, you will not have to restart from the very beginning of the level if you die. But, and this is a big but, like I mentioned earlier, each stage has a time limit, and depending on how far past a specific checkpoint you are when you die, you may respawn in a situation where there is no way you'll have enough time left in the level to actually beat the stage. And if you do run out of time, it's an immediate game over, no respawning or second chances, even if you have extra lives remaining. The good news is that the game saves your progress after each level, so there's no need to replay a level that you do finally beat. The bad news is that when you choose to start the game at a later level following a game over, you begin that level with 0 lives, which means those later stages need to be completed perfectly in order to progress. Once again, something you can overcome with practice, but a curious design decision nonetheless. Going back to the individual levels themselves, beyond having to navigate each stage and destroy a bunch of enemies, you'll also have to defeat a boss at the end of each stage before you can make it to your destination. This, again, is a frustrating situation when you first make your way to a boss, because it is entirely unclear what you need to do to actually defeat that boss. I spent one fight firing repeatedly at the dead center of the boss vehicle, only to have it continue to fire at me non-stop until eventually my shields were entirely depleted and I exploded in a ball of fiery death. Well, it turns out that the way to defeat each boss is to disable each weapon on their vehicle, and if you manage to do that, the boss explodes in his own ball of fiery death, which is a great feeling when that happens. After figuring out how to beat the bosses, you might think things become simple from there on out. Only no, not really, because those weapons that you need to destroy are constantly firing projectiles towards you. And because every projectile in the game is able to be attacked and destroyed, and because your blaster has a minor target lock-on kind of mechanic, what ends up happening is you're firing your blaster at the boss's weapon, only to instead have your blaster fire target the stream of projectiles emanating from that weapon. While this is something that you can overcome in due time, simply through attrition, it makes each boss fight take decidedly longer than it otherwise needs to, which combined with the time limit on each stage, further contributes to the difficulty of the game. Up to this point, we've talked about what I would consider to be the core continuous mechanics in the game, but there are also some occasional point-in-time kinds of situations that also add more meat to the overall experience. For one, and I have not mentioned this yet, you have a constant artificial intelligence companion who, in addition to appearing in several cutscenes, will also provide you with some important navigational directions at certain points in the game. Most of the time, those navigational pointers are intended to avoid an accident or road closure, which, if you don't follow his instructions, will most likely lead to an instant death. Other times, he may call out the location of a maintenance bay, which if you follow his directions will allow you to fully repair your ship, which is ridiculously useful and is a key to your prolonged survivability. That said, there are only 2 maintenance bays in the entire game, one on level 1 and one on level 2, so it's not like they're a prevalent part of the experience. When they turn up though, they're definitely a boon. Each level, while being very similar in terms of overall navigation and design, does have some gameplay differences that can add a little bit of spice to the experience, and this all has to do with the action assigned to your right mouse button, which changes throughout the game. On the first level, you have access to a horn which you can honk in the event that you come across a slower vehicle on the road. If you honk in time, you avoid a collision and maintain all of your ship's hull integrity. If you mistime your honk though, you'll collide in what amounts to a fender bender, but still results in some damage taken to your ship. In the second level, your right mouse button actually does nothing to the best of my memory, but in the third level, you gain the ability to use extra fuel cells to cause an area effect electron pulse that destroys every enemy in the immediate vicinity, giving you a bit of a breather before the next wave of enemies assault you. This can be useful, especially because on the final stage, you will take a ton of damage despite your best efforts with toggling your shield, and there is no maintenance bay to repair that damage. Because of the continuous enemy assault, a chunk of that final stage will likely be spent with 0 shields, or at a minimum, very low shields, without much of an opportunity to replenish them. Using those fuel cells buys you some precious seconds where your shield can recover, which can make the difference between surviving to the end of the stage and losing entirely. You do have to be careful though, because if you use too many fuel cells on that stage, you won't have enough fuel to launch yourself into space, which is yet another game over condition that, when it happened to me the first time, made me curse every designer that ever worked on this game. I eventually overcame that initial frustration, but still, definitely something I was not expecting. Another unexpected frustration, because to the best of my knowledge, the game does not tell you this, is that on certain levels, there are civilian transports that you can potentially shoot inadvertently, or in my case, intentionally, since I didn't realize they were civilians. Shooting those civilian vehicles, it turns out, is a bad idea, because it makes every enemy you fight dramatically more aggressive and gives them additional firepower that will make you think the game is broken. Seriously, I spent maybe around an hour or so of gameplay wondering why the heck these certain police enemies would occasionally shoot never-ending fireballs in my general direction, seemingly at random. In one playthrough, the barrage never stopped, and I began thinking to myself, the game must be broken. No, it turns out I was simply a homicidal maniac killing everything in sight, and the police were attempting to bring my murderous rampage to a halt. Good on them, but in the moment, I was very confused as to why the game hated me so much. Which is to say, if you do end up playing Loadstar, do not shoot the civilians. Trust me on this one, it is not a good idea. With all that said and all of those critiques out of the way, by the time I got to the end of the game, I think I had fun with the experience. I don't know, I'm still kinda on the fence. I suppose I'll come to a final conclusion as we talk more about the specific aspects of the game in a couple minutes. But first, before we can do that, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at, which is pre-pervasive internet, pre-YouTube gameplay videos. A lot of times back around this time when we would make a buying decision, that decision was made in the game store. We may have had word of mouth. We may have had magazine articles and reviews to look at. But a lot of times when we were standing in the store, we would walk down the aisle. We'd see a cool looking box on the shelf. We'd pick up the box. We'd flip it over. If the back of the box made the game sound cool, we might buy it. If it didn't, back on the shelf it would go. Now, before we take a look at the back of the box for Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine, I do have to mention that one of our Discord members and patrons, Bookie Gnu, actually found a copy of Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine in box, in the wild, in a retro game store in Australia. He posted a picture out on Discord, which was absolutely awesome. I love finding big box computer games out in the wild. It doesn't really happen all that often anymore. It used to be a little bit more prevalent years ago, but today I have really bad luck finding that kind of stuff out in the general kind of thrift store, retro game store kinds of things, or at least the ones around my area. So I thought it was awesome that he was able to actually find a copy of this game in the wild. So Bookie Gnu, thank you for posting that picture out on Discord. It was awesome to see. Anyway, for Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine, the back of the box says, Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine. Be Tully Bodine and take the assignment of your life. Get your cargo and get off the moon alive. There's no time to think and no room for mistakes to survive this run. Dodge accidents and outwit rival truckers to reach free space. Police toasters and SAPs are ready to toast you, so keep one hand on the wheel and a finger on the trigger. Push your PC into the 22nd century. Loadstar flies at hyperspeeds. This is the game your PC was built for. Amazing visuals, live action sequences, and stunning special effects and graphics. Hollywood actors Ned Beatty and Barry Primus star in Ron Cobb's spectacular sci-fi tale. And then there are a few screenshots showing the actual gameplay, and then the back of the box actually folds out to show some comments from different gaming magazines. Dimension 3 says, there is tons of video, a good story, and more action than you've ever before experienced in this type of game. GamePro's quote is here, and it just says ... awesome, which makes me wonder what was said before that word. PC Power says, a brilliantly presented and highly addictive shoot-'em-up, Loadstar screams at breakneck speed. Computer Gaming World says, it's a machinery-intensive SFX fest. And EGM says, Loadstar is a hot new CD that sends you right into the middle of science fiction spectacle. So that was the back of the box for Loadstar, and I've got to say, this would have sold me back in the day. I did not own Loadstar back when I was younger. I do own a copy today. I think I would have bought this game if I had looked more closely at it on the store shelves. I don't know why I passed it by or if I even really knew about it back then. I feel like I've heard about it before because, hey, randomly I decided, let's play Loadstar. I must have heard about it somewhere. I just don't remember if I actually saw it on the store shelves back when I was younger. Regardless, I did not buy it back then, but looking at the back of the box now, it's kind of a good box. It kind of sells the game, especially for somebody who enjoys full motion video titles. Anyway, we're now going to look at the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by looking at the graphics. The graphics in Loadstar are surprisingly decent, especially for a non-high definition full motion video title, with video scenes that are nicely detailed and a truly shocking production quality behind the video shoots. If I didn't know better, I'd say that the production team was filming a lower budget but still Hollywood level film, as all of the sets looked believable, costumes looked real, and cinematography felt professionally framed. You know how in many full motion video games, the video looks like it was filmed in front of a green screen, and even in the titles that look good, you can see they're more amateur than a traditional Hollywood production? Well, not so here, as I think Rocket Science Games actually built real quality sets for their actors to work in, which I thought was a great touch. The video itself was grainy, as you might expect given the age of the title, but still clear enough to see what was going on, and I was particularly impressed with the fact that the video sequences were presented in full screen glory, which was not a guarantee with full motion video titles of the time, many of which used reduced size videos to compensate for the amount of computing power needed to stream and in some cases decompress those videos. Loadstar used technology that allowed for those videos to all play in a full-screen display, and it was certainly a discriminator in comparison to other FMV games from the early and mid-90s. Beyond the filmed cutscenes, which both bookend each level as well as sometimes play in the middle of stages, there's also the track gameplay sections of the game, where you're effectively watching a streaming video that responds to your inputs and, at the appropriate points, shifts those video streams to the next logical segment of video based on your actions. At the same time, enemies and projectiles are overlaid on top of that video, creating the core gameplay loop you'll experience throughout your time with the title. Now here, I'd like to comment on two elements of the graphics. For one, the compositing of the overlaid enemy ships and projectiles, which from what I can tell are not pre-rendered FMV, really does mesh well with the streaming video, meaning they don't appear to be overlays. They appear to simply be part of the scene, and they look natural within those scenes. This is something that's super tricky to get right, and even with Sewer Shark, which is a game I really enjoyed, you can always see the overlaid graphics and can tell pretty easily that they're not truly part of the environment. Loadstar accomplishes those composite scenes with a level of expertise I simply did not expect, and I was definitely impressed. The other aspect of the gameplay stages that I was impressed with was the seamless way that one video stream spliced with the next, creating what felt like a never-ending set of tracks that never, and I mean never, hiccuped or stuttered or displayed any sort of hitching between disparate video streams. This made the whole game feel like a continuous movie without any appreciable gaps in gameplay, short of the disc swapping that had to occur in between levels, and I truly appreciated the quality of the video streaming technology at play here. Overall, I was pretty impressed by the graphical elements of the game, and while some aspects certainly show their age, the collective whole was still dramatically better than it had any right being. No complaints from my perspective, as it relates to the game's graphics. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in the game is a bit of a mixed bag, with the tracks that accompany the live-action full-motion video sequences being similar to what you might find in a B-movie, or perhaps a slightly better than basic cable television show, which honestly is absolutely fine given the context of the game. The music that plays during actual gameplay, though, is decidedly worse, with what appears to be a fully synthesized MIDI-based soundtrack playing in the background as you attempt to decimate the enemy forces. Now, I need to preface what I'm about to say by reminding everyone that I am a huge fan of synthesis-based music in video and computer games, and some of my favorite game soundtracks of all time originated from the days of pre-orchestrated video game music. That being said, the synthesized music in Loadstar is simply mediocre. It's serviceable, but not really much beyond that, and its inclusion is also a little bit puzzling, as the game shipped on 3 CDs, which very easily could have included CD-quality audio playing throughout the game. Even if it were simply 1 minute of audio looped per level, it would have shown an extra effort to improve the multimedia capabilities of the title, and there was a precedent for that quality because the acted cutscenes did in fact seem to use real, so to speak, musical backgrounds. I'm assuming there was some technical limitation that drove the team to make this design decision, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. Sound effects, meanwhile, were all well done and meshed well with the action on the screen, and any voiced lines all sounded pretty darn good, as did the general audio for any full motion video cutscenes, which, as you might expect, sounded like a movie. I don't think there was anything offensive about the audio or sound design for the game, but I still think the team had the aptitude to do a better job here. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Tully Bodine, space trucker for hire, and someone who has garnered the respect of his peers for his legendary trucker-based exploits, not to mention his prior experience as a United American Ranger during the terrestrial war against true light fundamentalists that had occurred years prior. One day, Bodine is approached by a shifty-looking individual with a proposition. Transport a bunch of camels from one end of the planet to the next, and you'll receive a significant payday. Bodine decides this sounds like a pretty easy job with significant upside, so he agrees to the deal. Only, unbeknownst to Bodine, these camels are actually considered contraband, and as a result, Bodine draws the attention of the local space police, who begin pursuing him across the planet in an attempt to bring him to justice. Whether Bodine survives or not is entirely up to the player. Will he make it to his camel delivery destination, or will he end up as space dust? His fate is in your hands. So, this story, I guess, is okay. I mean, it's kinda silly, and it's pretty threadbare, and the whole game amounts to transport camels, gather fuel, avoid police, shoot bad guys, which isn't really that deep of a narrative experience. But regardless, it kinda works, I think. I think my uncertainty here stems from the fact that if you read the game manual, there are literally pages worth of backstory about the game world, its characters, the enemies you'll face, the vehicles you'll encounter, and pretty much anything else you could want to know. Only barely any of it comes out during the game itself, outside of the very basic objective-driven goal that you're being asked to complete. In some game types, that's totally fine, as the focus there is on gameplay, not story. But this is an FMV title, and as such, I kinda expected more narrative than what we got, especially given the fact that we have real actors who could convey and deliver that story. What the game had was fine, but I really wanted more here. That said, I do recognize this was meant to be the first part in an eventual video game series, so I'm going to guess the development team was eventually going to deliver more content in terms of story, but never got the chance to execute on that plan. I have no proof of that, but I feel like it's a valid assumption, because otherwise the title of the game really doesn't make any sense. It's called Loadstar, the Legend of Tully Bodine, and with a story that basically boiled down to transporting some camels from point A to point B, it kinda seems like the legend part was missing from the narrative. I don't know, maybe my expectations were too high, but I thought the story left something to be desired. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've already talked a good bit about the overall controls for the title, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. Effectively, the game comes down to navigating tracks using your arrow keys, aiming and shooting your weapon using your mouse, activating and deactivating your shields using the up arrow on your keyboard, and activating special maneuvers using your right mouse button. And in all instances, the controls work just fine. In fact, I'd say the controls are more responsive and smooth than many other on-rails shooters, and after a few minutes, you'll likely be used to the controls. Mastering those controls and the timing of shield activation and track navigation will take some time, but both are entirely learnable in relatively short order. From a playability perspective, the game is both a great example of an on-rails shooter and a frustrating example of an on-rails shooter, depending on whether you're playing easy or hard mode. On easy mode, the game is pretty darn fun, and despite there still being challenging moments, the game never feels unfair or too difficult. On hard mode, the game feels kinda merciless, and it will take significant practice in order to be successful. Sometimes when you play a game, the need to refine your skills is part of the core gameplay experience, and the simple act of getting better at a game is a worthwhile endeavor by itself. I'm not sure that applies here though, as the newfound skills you'll acquire don't really result in a better gameplay experience. Those skills simply let you play the game in the first place, which is a bit underwhelming. All told, the game remains playable even today, but unless you're up for a challenge and really want to spend hours playing a game about a trucker transporting a load of contraband camels, I'm not sure I can recommend playing the hard mode. Easy mode, though, I do encourage you to check out if you have any interest in FMV on-rails shooter experiences from the 90s. The bottom line here is that Loadstar was equal parts fun and frustrating, and I ended up experiencing a roller coaster of emotions as I played the game. I do think there was goodness here, and the game does have its merits. I'm just not sure it's able to properly convey those merits to players, unless those players have a good chunk of spare time on their hands. This is not a pick up and play kind of experience, despite the simplicity of its design, so make sure you know what you're getting into if you decide to play this one. So what is our verdict on Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine? Well, I've got to say, it is an interesting title, in that it both provides a solid on-rails shooter experience, while also adding in some design decisions that actively make the game more difficult to play than many of its brethren. Some of those design decisions lead to increased engagement with the game, which is good, but at the same time can also make the game feel like more of a chore to play than a fun leisure activity. It's not entirely without merit, but I can't say the good outweighs the bad with this one, which is why for me, Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine is the newest addition to our list of mediocre mentions. It's not an incompetently designed game, and it can become fun after playing it for a while, but from my perspective, there's a bit too much of a barrier to fun here to really be worth your time, and there aren't other redeeming factors to offset that barrier. The story is simple and somewhat silly, and despite the relatively high-quality FMV sequences, I feel like the development team didn't really execute all that well on the premise. There was promise here, and I'm assuming if future titles were able to be made, some of those critiques could have been addressed. That is not what ended up happening though, which is why from my perspective, Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine never rises above mediocrity, and is therefore the newest inductee into our ignoble collection of mediocre mentions. That was our episode on Loadstar, The Legend of Tully Bodine. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the first-person shooter, Serious Sam, The First Encounter. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not-so-fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible content I can. The only way to do that is to hear feedback from all of you to make sure that I am hitting the mark. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow our community, and I want to continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Serious Sam, The First Encounter. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.